So our next presentation is by Dr. Ian Isherwood, who is visiting assistant professor, War and Memory Studies at Gettysburg College. And his topic is Writing the Great War, Veterans, Literature, and the War's Memory. So, Dr. Isherwood.
Well, thank you so much, and thank you for having me. This is one of my favorite places to come to. Being over in Gettysburg, we're reasonably close, so I like to come over here and do some work when I'm able to. I was also very fortunate when I was doing my dissertation a few years ago to receive a small grant from Dr. Summers, actually, the Ridgeway grant here, so that I was able to finish my dissertation while I was working here with this fabulous library. So some of the research that you're going to see here comes from that dissertation, which has now been turned into a book, Remembering the Great War, which was published this spring. So if any of you are interested in any of the material that I'm going to be talking about, there is a book that has just come out on the subject of the Great War Memoirs, principally British memoirs, and the way in which veterans reflected upon the war within the interwar period. I'd like to do two things with this talk. The first part is to discuss the topic at hand, but then I would like to actually show you a digital history project at the end of my talk that I've queued it up already that I can go over and show you. It's a digital history project on the First World War that we've developed at Gettysburg College. And the reason I want to show it to you is because, one, we're very proud of the project, but also it's been something in which a faculty member, me, some administrators at the college, but also some students have worked on with us. And there's something that kind of boils my blood is when people say to me, well, nobody's really interested in the First World War, that young people aren't that interested in the First World War. And it's been my experience that's not true. I have at home right now 26 blue books from my First World War class, where 26 eager students signed up for a whole semester talking about the First World War. I've taught that class 4 times, and each time it's been a full class of people who are very interested in engaging with the complex historiography of the Great War. So we have students that are working on it at Gettysburg College. We have students that are working in digital history, which is new for students to be able to explore their interest in history. And I'd like to share some of that with you because I am unabashedly proud of the work that my students do. I'm here to discuss with you the idea of how veterans write war and how the way in which they write war informs our perception of conflicts. And I decided to focus my talk on the subject of kind of the way in which literature informs public memory. And the reason being is because I think that we live in times in which veterans reflect oftentimes about the conflicts in which they fight in. And those perceptions, I think, are relatively privileged in the way in which we look at combat. And one of the things that always stands out if you teach war literature or if you teach any subject in military history or in memory studies is that students are very, very interested. They're very interested in personal accounts. So it's not just what the war does to the world, but it's what the war does to me, or what the war does to the veteran. And that concept is kind of essential to this talk, how the war is internalized, how it's communicated from somebody who goes through it, and how that communicative process then, in turn, informs the way in which we see the First World War, which is, as you probably all know, a very, very literary war in the way in which it's been remembered, in the way in which its history has been seen. I'd like to begin with a quote, which is something I tell my students never to do in the papers. And that quote is coming from a fellow by the name of Ian Hay. And Ian Hay was a Scottish novelist who wrote a best-selling war book in Britain. In 1915, he wrote the book. It was called The First 100,000. Has anybody heard of this book? It's a very interesting book. You should have a look at it because he was a serving army officer who wrote an account of being one of the first 100,000 Kitchener volunteers in Britain. And the book was published during the First World War. It was a bestseller during the war. It was read by officers in the trenches. It was a book that was seen very much as being this patriotic expression of war enthusiasm, patriotic expression of a young officer going off and meeting their first battle in the First World War. It was a best-selling book. Hay ended up, it ended up being a best-selling book during the interwar period, so it was reprinted widely. And Hay went on to a very distinguished career as a novelist, largely based on this and some other works in which he did. Now, what's interesting is that Hay was kind of a patriotic author of the stiff upper lip sort. He was a former British schoolmaster before he became an officer, and he reflected upon the war later in 1936 in a very interesting way. He was writing an essay as a preface to another war book, and he wrote in 1936 that for the last 10 years we have been submerged by a flood of so-called war books which depict the men who fought as brutes and beasts, as living like pigs, and dying like dogs. Disillusioned, drunken, and godless. What a great book title that would be, by the way. Disillusioned, drunken, and godless. Some of these books are just ordinary dull dirt, conceived in dirt and sold for the profit that dirt brings. We need not worry about them. But others are undoubtedly sincere. Their object, of course, is obvious and understandable. To paint war in such horrible colors that nobody will ever fight again. Now remember, he's saying this in 1936. The world is becoming an increasingly insecure place in Europe in the 1930s. Now I think that Hay's opinion about the war literature of his day is revealing for several different reasons. And these reasons are at the heart of the talk that I'm giving. First is that veterans wrote widely about their experiences in the Great War, far more widely than I think most people think. Secondly, it's that veterans interpreted their war experiences in varied ways. The idea of a uniform memory or a uniform literature of the Great War isn't a historical one, though I would say that the idea of a predominant memory of the war, meaning predominant social memory of the war, is something that has certainly formed along national lines over the course of the long 20th century. Third, I think that the Great War's literature, perhaps more than any other medium, has contributed to the idea of a contested and controversial form of war memory, and has had a more lasting impact than maybe any other medium of the First World War. So what I want to do is look at the phenomenon of the Veterans War Book and see how that, in turn, has shaped our understanding of the Great War. And I will be using mostly Anglo-American sources, in part because I just finished a book on this material, but please know that the literature of the Great War, of course, is much broader than just Anglo-American published sources. It was, after all, a world war. So what I'd like to do is have a look at war literature before the First World War, to then put the First World War into context. Does anyone know who that fellow is? It's Ambrose Bierce. He was a Civil War writer, undoubtedly. Some of you have read some of Ambrose Bierce's work. So war literature does not, of course, begin with modernity. War literature is as old as literature. That being said, in the 19th century, we see an expansion of published war literature in Europe and in America. And the reasons for this expansion of war literature is largely twofold. One is because of increased literacy. So with increased literacy, you have a larger pool of people to sell books to, for people to consume print culture. Two, periodicals become cheaper, and supplies for printing become cheaper because of industrialization during the 19th century. So you have two things. You have the fact that books are becoming cheaper to produce, to print, to make, and you have consumers that are becoming widely more literate. And so what we end up seeing in the 19th century is that war literature becomes kind of its own distinctive genre. Okay? And you see a lot of war books that emerge within the 19th century, and they take all kinds of different forms. Okay? Poetry, incredibly popular in the 19th century, so people write war poetry. Short stories are kind of a new genre, but they're ones in which people are writing short stories, and Bierce is a great example of this. Okay? Bierce's short stories about the American Civil War are still some of the most widely read short stories of the American Civil War. We see novels. We see memoirs, sometimes called reminiscences. we see published diaries and published letters of soldiers serving at various fronts. And of course, we see published histories of the war, in particular, a genre of the unit history or the regimental history. And there are hundreds, if not thousands, of regimental histories that are published within the 19th century. So we can see in the American Civil War, and it's a convenient example for me to pick, because we see a lot of similarities in what happens in the American Civil War with what then happens in the First World War in terms of print culture, in terms of war books. What we end up seeing in the American Civil War is we see growing literacy, plus growing print culture, plus then a new phenomenon, which is the growth and size of armies to incorporate citizen soldiers. So you see citizens who become soldiers, which increases your pool of potential authors. You see this increased pool of potential authors then having the ability to write their own tales, to write their own war stories, some during the war, but most writing after the war of their own, of their experiences. And what we see in the Civil War is we see, of course, a literary canon that emerges of Civil War writing. People like Melville and Whitman, Louisa May Alcott, Mark Twain even writes about his very brief Civil War service, Ambrose Bierce, and later Stephen Crane, who doesn't serve during the war, but of course writes probably the most well-known book about the Civil War. So we see kind of a literary canon that emerges around these iconic sort of American authors, but then running beneath them is also a ton of print culture that simply hasn't survived into the 20th century beyond kind of the interests of scholars. And these are war memoirs that are written of soldiers' service. These are regimental histories, which are largely bought and consumed by other veterans. These are short stories that are written for periodicals after the war. And of course, we see accounts by generals and we see accounts by politicians that are published in the 1870s, 1880s, and 1890s. And what we see from this kind of broad literature that's published after the Civil War, 3-4 decades after the Civil War, we see hundreds of war books that are flooding the American marketplace. And what they're doing is they're participating, these soldiers are writing books, and they're participating in kind of a memory culture that is contesting and discussing the importance of the American Civil War. It's within this period that we see what Robert Penn Warren defined as kind of the two great myths to emerge in the Civil War's memory, which are the treasury of virtue in the North and then the great alibi or the lost cause in the South. These are largely coming from this print culture, from this explosion of kind of veterans writing which you see after the Civil War. So why am I droning on and on about the Civil War? This is supposed to be about the First World War, right? Well, this type of pattern is repeated. It's repeated in combatant nations as a result of the First World War, where you have a citizen soldier base that then publishes widely as the war is ongoing, but then publishes afterward and contests their memories afterward and debates their memories afterward in print. So you see the same thing that ends up happening in the Civil War ends up happening in Europe and in America after the First World War. Now, we should add into this mix kind of a description about what war literature is looking like going into the First World War before we then dive into ways in which we can look at First World War literature. And that is, in the late 19th century, you see war literature is an important genre. You see other genres that emerge with it. So imperial adventure stories are another genre that piggybacks actually quite well with war stories during the 19th century. And these are coming out of a culture of sentimentality, a Victorian, Edwardian culture of sentimentality, where people are looking at war, they're looking at imperial exploration and adventure as a cultural muse to be able to see a form of heroism, right? So they're defining heroism, largely masculine type of heroism, along these lines, about men proving themselves either in battle or proving themselves through exploration and through feats of great adventure. So what we end up seeing is going into the 20th century that these stories are popular because they're reinforcing an image that I think a lot of people want to have of themselves or want to perceive of young men going into the 20th century. Now, in 1975, a very important book in First World War history and First World War literature was published, and it's The Great War in Modern Memory by Paul Fussell. Some of you undoubtedly have probably seen the book or have the book on your shelves or have read the book. And it's a very, very important book in kind of understanding the cultural shift, the shift that ends up happening during the First World War to the war generation as it's fighting. In The Great War in Modern Memory, Paul Fussell makes an impassioned case that the First World War was not only a cataclysmic political event, but that it also is a cataclysmic cultural event. Okay? It's one that causes a type of shift in Anglo and Anglo-American history by ushering in a new, ironic, and cynical form of modernity. And this is well represented through the experience of trench fighting. As a work of history, I think Fussell's book has been criticized by a number of historians, but as an intellectual thought experiment, I think it deserves special notice. His connection between the war's literature and the memory of the First World War in the 1970s helps us understand something about the way that modern culture wants to remember the First World War, which is, of course, different than the way in which veterans themselves remembered the First World War. And one of the common criticisms of the Great War in Modern Memory is that this is war literature interpreted for the Vietnam generation and not necessarily reflecting what veteran culture was looking at in the 1920s. So methodologically, this is an interesting thing, right? That memory changes over time, and that the way in which we read war literature is sometimes through the lens of the conflicts that we understand currently. Okay? Fussell's book actually opens up a lot of different questions in that regard with First World War literature. So what I would say is that we need to be a little bit delicate in the way that we judge print sources, the way in which we judge war books, because they can certainly tell us very important things about the experience of war. But there's a lot that they can't tell us, and if we generalize too broadly with them, we run the risk then of distorting the message that I think a lot of these soldiers, soldier writers, soldier poets were trying to tell us about the conflicts in which they were fighting. One thing to keep in mind is that war books are interpretive documents, meaning they not only recall events, so they not only tell you, here's what I saw during the war, but they also then reimagine those events. And the devil is in kind of the details of the reimagination. Okay? That's where we see the framework that changes a little bit. And even with nonfiction writing, even with memoirs that are reportedly true, these memoirs also are going through a creative process of rewriting the history in which the person is living. So here are some examples for us. Okay? Here's some key points and then a few examples of war writers within the context of their time. First is that the Great War does not generate one uniform literary memory, but instead it proves a muse for thousands of works of individual memory that were then written in the context of the war's overall social memory. So what we have is we have war writers who are writing about their individual experiences, but then we have them writing those individual experiences within the political and social context in which they're writing themselves. So the way that societies remember and commemorate conflict is actually important to war books that are being written at the time. Okay? Secondly, the war was incredibly culturally transformative. That is certainly true. Okay? Societies that go through the First World War are forever altered by it. But so is, of course, the war's memory, or the idea of the war's memory over time. It changes with the 20th century. And oftentimes, with my students, one of the hardest things to get them to do is to actually look at the First World War on its own terms and not to see it through the lens of the Second World War. Right? They tend to see the First World War as being kind of the first attempt at a world war, okay? And then the Second World War is really kind of what finishes the legacy of the First World War, which is trying to get them to think about the First World War on its own terms. It's a very difficult thing because of all of the events that came as a result of it. Now, I want to give you a few examples of how the process works for writers, of individuals who are writing their memories, written them within the context of social memory. The first is a writer by the name of Ernst Junger. Has anyone read Ernst Junger? Okay. Ernst Junger is a German army officer who was promoted, he became an officer during the war, a junior army officer, was a stormtrooper, was wounded a gazillion times in the Western Front. Ernst Jünger kind of left a piece of Ernst Jünger in whatever part of the front he was serving, okay? Ernst Jünger was incredibly highly decorated. After the war, was still a serving army officer, and he sat down to write his memoir in the early 1920s, which is called Storm of Steel. It's well worth you picking up and having a look at it. Now, Jünger's memoir is written within the context of the early 1920s. Jünger was a romantic youth who went off to fight. He was an ardent German nationalist. And after the war, when of course Germany is labeled with war guilt from the Versailles Treaty, Ernst Jünger's book, in many ways, is a heroic reaction to the idea of war guilt, in many ways a heroic reaction against the idea of moral vindication in the early 1920s in Germany, which is incredibly socially and politically volatile time period to actually live in. Right? So Jünger's book's actually reflecting that. It's kind of a pushback against the political volatility that we see in Germany in the early 1920s. To contrast with Jünger, a book that all of you know is Erich Remarque's All Quiet on the Western Front, which Remarque writes in the late 1920s. It's published in 1928 in Germany, 1929 in Britain, and in the United States. And Erich Remarque's All Quiet is, of course, the disillusionment tome of the First World War. It is the best-selling war book that comes out in the 1920s and 1930s. It's a runaway bestseller. It becomes a best-selling film the following year in 1930. And Remarque's book very much is reflecting the late 1920s. Right? And the criticism that a lot of veterans give toward Remarque's work is that he doesn't accurately reflect the spirit of soldiers in the trenches, but instead is reflecting a sense of cynicism and disillusionment found after 10 years of political volatility within Germany, within Europe. Okay? So you see social memory that's actually informing the idea of individual memories. Okay? So those are two examples that are coming from Germany, some well-known ones that are coming from Germany. So as we move forward and we examine how the war was written, we should keep in mind the fact that within this type of scholarship, when we're looking at war literature, that sometimes the sand beneath our feet seems to shift a bit. And we should be cautious of stereotyping veterans' narratives by claiming kind of a universal war story to come out of the conflict. Now that being said, the war produced a number of different truths that when we see comprehensively, if we're thinking about kind of surveying the literary landscape of the First World War, we should keep in mind David Lean's desert scenes from Lawrence of Arabia, right? Those slow shots that are creeping across. Fill the desert, though, with libraries full of books, and that's what you have of the war's experiences. You have a slow shot of varying experiences in panorama, and from that panorama, we can get an impression of what the war's impact was. So when we talk about the war's experiences, what do we mean? What kind of literature is actually being written and produced about the war in the 1920s and 1930s? Well, most of you have in your minds an idea of what First World War literature is. It's probably of the Western Front. It's a destroyed landscape, it's darkness, it's a dirty landscape, dingy and muddy, it's polluted. And these themes oftentimes resonate. When we think of the First World War, and we say First World War literature, we think of Wilfred Owen and Dulce et Decorum Est, right? We think of gas, of mud, of blood, and futility. And most of the books that are written in English about the First World War come from this theater. They come from the Western Front. So that reflects the overall importance of the Western Front, but it also shows you that most soldiers, most of this pool of citizen authors, are serving in that theater of operations. The largest pool is right there. That's why we have the most war literature that's coming from there. And trench books really form in our minds an iconic image of what the First World War was. They also play into notions of victory and defeat and morale, and the ideology that's associated with the conflict. Yet, the war itself was an imperial one. It was not limited to this one theater, and neither were novels and memoirs that were written about it. Each theater, in fact, generates its own small group of war literature. Much of it was written and published in Britain due to the fact that the British Empire's war efforts were the most expansive. what we see are accounts that come from Serbia and Salonika. We see first-hand accounts from Palestine and Mesopotamia. If you want to juxtapose the war's experiences in the starkest relief, look at accounts of officers serving in Palestine or Mesopotamia and contrast those to the Western Front. We see accounts from East Africa. We see accounts from naval officers on the high seas, from Persia, and we do see a group of dozens of prisoner of war memoirs. They come from prisoner of war camps, POW camps in Turkey and central Anatolia, which are largely the story of suffering. We also see from POW accounts in Germany. And a good number of these accounts actually feature the idea of escape, the escaped POW, which we'll talk about in just a second. So what we see is each theater of operations produces its own version of the imperial war effort, shows us something about the different fronts of the globalized war. And what's actually really interesting is 30% of British war books that are published in the interwar period come from one of these sideshow theaters. So about a third of all war literature that we see comes from one of these sideshows. The best known is, of course, T.E. Lawrence's Revolt in the Desert, which then becomes the Seven Pillars of Wisdom. But there were a bunch of people who served with Lawrence who also published their accounts kind of writing on his fame and his coattails. So that's an essential point, I think. It's that the veteran fought on many fronts. The veteran served with many different experiences, and from every theater ends up writing about those experiences. Similarly, the war writer of the First World War, to borrow John Keegan's phrase, saw many different faces of battle. So the changing face of warfare contributes to different subgenres of war literature. These are ones that are focused on military occupation or unique experiences. So we see a large number of infantry officers, waterlogged infantry officers of the Western Front who publish their accounts. Okay? We know these stories. Your Siegfried Sassoon, your Robert Graves, your Edmund Blundens. Okay? But then we also see accounts by gunners and sappers. We see accounts by medical officers, VADs, and nurses. Some accounts from people serving with aid organizations like the YMCA. We see accounts by chaplains, medical orderlies, stretcher bearers. And these are folks that are all seeing a different war than the one that's being waged in the front line. So we see accounts not only coming from the front lines, but we see the idea of war literature expanding beyond just the soldier themselves. There are other forms of martial activity and other forms of martial literature that are emerging. One of the most distinctive is, of course, the pilot. And pilot literature of the First World War is an abundant subgenre. And it's a subgenre that still inspires a lot of historians and literary scholars because of the juxtaposition of pilots who looked to the air for a sense of martial agency and heroism, a sense of martial agency and heroism that they simply could not find fighting in the trenches and fighting on the ground. These self-proclaimed knights of the air created and guarded their own heroic mythology. And this is one that lasts throughout the rest of the 20th century, both in terms of First World War pilots that then, of course, inspired the few, the Spitfire pilots of the Second World War, but I would even argue goes forward even into the space race, right, in which astronauts are being lifted up and being with the kind of the same heroic type of mythology of pilots of the First World War. And so pilots are incredibly important, and they sell books within the interwar period in abundance, mostly books that are based on notions of adventure. We also see spies that are writing during the First World War. Before he wrote the best-selling novel Whiskey Galore, has anybody heard of it? There's a Scottish author by the name of Compton Mackenzie, who was a best-selling novelist before the war and then after the war. Well, he served at Gallipoli as a staff officer and then ended up serving in counter-espionage in Greece and ended up writing 4 war memoirs about his experiences in counter-espionage and his experiences at the Dardanelles. As I said before, the boredom of captivity also provided a muse. Similar to the American Civil War, prisoners of war wrote in abundance. They wrote stories not only of cruel treatment at the hands of those who were holding them, but also of their escape attempts. So before films were mythologizing great escapes, we see scores of former POWs writing about their own great escapes from central Anatolia and from Germany. The point here is that the war's veterans served many roles. Their accounts have variety, and they published the war in the interwar period from phases of battle that are different than our stereotyped image of what the First World War was. Now, to show you something about the numbers in which we're talking about with war literature, I wanted to pull up this tidy little graph. Now, this reflects fiction and nonfiction war books that are published within the interwar period. And it shows us a couple different trends of war literature. We see kind of the largest number of individual titles are in the interwar period are published immediately after the war. And what this is indicative of is the fact that during the war, there's a publishing boom of martial literature. People want accounts from the war, and this carries over afterward in the first years of peace. We then see published First World War literature takes a bit of a dip in the 1920s, right? Publishers accept fewer manuscripts, fewer people are writing them. There are a number of different reasons for this that I can talk about within the Q&A if you would like. But then we see war literature picks up, publishers start publishing more of it, writers start seeking publication for their war books in the late 1920s for a couple of different reasons. One is because the late 1920s marks the 10-year anniversary of the First World War, so people are being reflective because of the 10-year anniversary. Publishers also like anniversaries, they like publishing books around them. And the other reason is because of Remarque's best-selling All Quiet on the Western Front, which when it comes out in English in 1929, it sells 60,000 copies in just a few months. So British publishers start contracting more war writers kind of on the coattails of Remarque's All Quiet on the Western Front. Everybody wants to be the next Eric Remarque, and pretty much nobody was. So what we end up seeing is that we end up seeing kind of different phases of the war's publishing history. But in the late 1920s, we see an ongoing public debate by veterans over new war literature that's being published. And it's in the late 1920s that we see some of the most iconic war books that come out. Remarque's work, okay, but also works by Siegfried Sassoon, Memoirs of a Fox Hunting Man, Memoirs of an Infantry Officer, Schurston's Progress, Robert Graves in Goodbye to All That, okay, Edmund Blunden, Undertones of War in 1928. Even T.E. Lawrence's Revolt in the Desert is part of this trend. It comes out in 1927. It's right at the beginning of war books picking up. Okay. So we end up seeing in the late 1920s, Hemingway's Affair at Arms comes out in 1929. We end up seeing within the late 1920s a number of new war books that become bestsellers that are on the tips of people's tongues. Now with these war books comes controversy, because there's a thought by some people that the new war books, and these are oftentimes veterans who are doing the criticizing, these new war books are distorting the memory of the First World War. That these new war books are too cynical, they are sensationalized, and they are deeply, deeply disillusioned. And it's that word that keeps coming up over and over again amongst veterans. Okay? So what we end up seeing in the 20s is something about the polemical nature of war memoirs within the interwar period. Veterans were engaging with the war's memory in this period because, as Samuel Hines would argue, it was the most important event in their young lives. The war was also an opportunity for amateur as well as professional writers to engage with a subject of heightened emotional value, one in which they think framed the rest of their young adulthood. Now, what I'd like to do is have a look at some case studies in First World War literature so that we can see something of the way in which some veterans are reflecting on it, to give you some variety in the ways that veterans are reflecting upon their war experiences. And I deliberately picked examples from the 1929 through 1933 period because that's what I was just talking about. Okay? The first is Robert Graves. Robert Graves is an interesting figure, but Robert Graves wrote in his own autobiography, which largely has to do with the First World War, in 1929. He writes it in about 6 weeks in the spring of 1929, and it's published in November of that year. And it's a bestseller. Okay? It sells 40,000 copies by the end of the
the year, Graves does very well for himself in writing his autobiography. The book's entitled Goodbye to All That. As you would imagine with that kind of title, what do you think Graves is trying to say about the war? See it, right? He's trying to say goodbye to the war. He's also trying to say goodbye to other certain things as well as the war in writing it. Now, the book was controversial, and it elicited controversy from even some of his close friends. Edmund Blunt and Siegfried Sassoon objected to the book's content, and most of the objections to Graves were that he was making a mockery of something that a lot of veterans thought was sacred. Okay? And that was the idea of men's sacrifice during the war, men's bravery during the war. Okay? So the idea that Graves was mocking bravery, was mocking heroism, was mocking those who gave their lives for a cause or for country, was something that came out after his book was published. And what's interesting is Graves felt the need to publish in 1930 another book in which he answered his critics in the first chapter. It's called But It Still Goes On. Graves is a funny guy. So he publishes But It Still Goes On in 1930, and in that book he wrote an interesting refutation to those who criticized his book for its inaccuracies or the false way it was representing the Western Front. And what Graves wrote was, the memoirs of a man who went through some of the worst experiences of trench warfare are not truthful if they don't contain a high proportion of falsities. High explosive barrages will make a temporary liar or visionary out of anyone. The old trench mind is at work, and all overestimation of casualties, unnecessary dwelling of horrors, mixing of dates and confusion between trench rumors and scenes actually witnessed. Very interesting quote that Graves is giving us about the nature of how people remember and how they reconstruct their war memories later on. A liar and a visionary are not the same thing, right? So Graves is being a little bit playful with this quote, but he, of course, is answering his critics in a way in which he's calling into question the subjectivity of war, or the objectivity of war memoirs. The second person I want to talk about was Vera Brittain. And Vera Brittain served as a VAD during the First World War. She served on the Western Front, giving care to wounded men. And Vera Brittain published her war book in 1933, called Testament of Youth. And it, too, was a bestseller. It sold 100,000 copies in 12 impressions in the 1930s. It's a best-selling book. Brittain wrote the book because she said, why should all these young men have the war to themselves? Surely my story is as interesting as theirs, and it certainly is. Now, Brittain described her own youth as being smashed up by the war. Her emphasis in writing the book was on truth-telling about the war's horrors, but also, in her words, to provide an indictment against war itself. So her book very much is a reflection of Britain's pacifist feelings as they have developed since the First World War itself. And in the 1930s, she is hitting her stride very much as a very outspoken, politically involved, pacifist, feminist writer within the early 1930s. And she writes in Testament of Youth, she says, I was beginning already to suspect that my generation had been deceived. This idea of generational betrayal is part of the reason that she's writing. The young were betrayed by the old, that they were sent to their deaths in an unnecessary or a futile war. I was beginning already to suspect that we had been deceived. Young courage cynically exploited, its idealism betrayed, and I did not want to know the details of that betrayal, she continues. And though a few isolated persons may be better for having been in the war, the world as a whole will be worse, lacking first-rate ability, social order, and economic equilibrium. It will go spinning down into chaos as fast as it can, unless some of us try to prevent it. These are very much 1933 feelings, right? Very much 1933 feelings, very much early 1930s politics that's working its way into her war memories. Okay? I want to contrast these two writers and the way in which they're describing their war experiences with two other ones. The first is Charles Carrington, who published his war book, A Subaltern's War, under the pseudonym Charles Edmonds in 1929. Carrington is an interesting figure. His book, A Subaltern's War, it too sells very, very well in 1929. But it is a vastly different book than that written by Marx, a vastly different book than that written by Robert Graves. Now, Carrington established or thought that his book was a more accurate representation of the fighting spirit of men in the trenches, in part because the two largest chapters within the book, chapter on the Battle of the Somme and chapter on the Battle of Passchendaele, were both written, one was written in 1919 and one was written in 1920. And Carrington thought because they were written fresh in his mind when he got back from the war, that made his account closer to the actual truth, the truth of his mentality during the war. So Carrington had his book published in 1929. He had to add some more filler material around those two battle narratives, which he did so. And then he described in the book, in both his introduction and the conclusion to the book, his feelings about other war books and about his motivations for writing and publishing The Subaltern's War. He wrote that it is my hope that the rather romantic tone may strike a responsive chord in the hearts of some old soldiers who are tired of uniform disillusion of most authors of war books. For it's time that the world remembered that among the 15 million there were other types as well as militarists and equally conventional pessimists. So he's trying to thread something of the middle ground here. He also writes later in the book this very, very pithy quote that demonstrates how he is internalizing the war and the war's sufferings. The greater the horror, he wrote, the nobler the triumph of the man who is not morally ruined by it. And Carrington very much is seeing the writing of disillusioned war veterans or sensationalized war books in the 1920s as being against the spirit of men who were fighting during the war. He is also seeing it, though, as in many ways attacking the virtue in a traditional sense of the men who were fighting. Similar to Carrington is the author Guy Chapman. And Chapman lacked kind of the fierce polemic that Carrington had against the idea of generational disillusionment. But Chapman ends up writing a memoir called A Passionate Prodigality in 1933. He actually writes it in 1930 in the midst of the war books boom, but he publishes it in 1933, the same year as Vera Brittain. And Vera Brittain and Guy Chapman's wife are actually friends. His wife is Storm Jameson, who's a pretty well-known interwar memoir, or novelist. And she was friends of Vera Brittain, so he's running in the same social circle. Now, Chapman's interesting because he writes an account that, in many ways, he's trying to figure out what the war's meaning is to him as he's actually writing it. The dedication of the book is to the memory of certain soldiers who have now become a small quantity of Christian dust, this faint reanimation. So he's dedicating the book to soldiers he served with who were killed during the war. And he describes his own memories of the conflict as a faint reanimation. The idea to animate, to give life to something, is the way in which he's looking at his memories. Okay? He is reanimating them, he is infusing them with new life in the 1930s. Now, Chapman was no war lover, but he found a sense of martial virtue in the notion of comradeship. And the first quote here is largely about that. He says, "For a long time I used to think of myself as part of a battalion and not as an individual. During all that time of the war, the forms, the colors of that experience possessed a part of my senses. My life was involved with other men." So the close bonds that he forms with other men in battle largely becomes the narrative of the book, right? He's trying to tell the story of a battalion of men who are going off and serving, and some of them being killed, and some of them being wounded and mutilated in battle. He's trying to tell their story sympathetically. Now, he's no war lover. Chapman is very, very ambiguous about the concept of whether war had any kind of greater meaning to him, any kind of greater truth to him. But he does say something interesting about the nature of war. He says, "Once you have lain in her arms, you can admit no other mistress. No wine gives fierce intoxication, no drug more vivid exultation. Every writer of imagination who sat down in honesty his experiences has confessed it. Even those who hate her most are prisoners to her spell." So what I've been trying to do is to show you some of the variety of war literature in the decades after the First World War. They proved a time in history, the 20s and 30s, when the war's history itself was becoming memory, and the writings of war veterans, veterans themselves, were becoming published and active agents in the war's literary memorialization. The men and women who wrote within the war generation did so for all kinds of different motivations, but they believed that their stories were important enough to write to publish alongside of hundreds of others. So I've tried to put the war's literary output into some kind of context, and maybe encourage some of you to pick up some other books, and to also offer some context in the way in which societies themselves see conflicts and interpret conflicts through literature or through artistic mediums. I think that the lessons that we can learn from studying the war books boom, the war books debate of the interwar period, are ones that are easily applied or appropriated to our present day, as we understand the way in which we see wars that are being waged conveyed back to people in our own time. The sentiment of remembrance, the sacred nature of sacrifice. This is something we can certainly understand within the 20th century. Now, as such, I want to conclude with another quote from Guy Chapman. Guy Chapman, later in his life in the 1960s, had something provocative about the way in which the First World War was being remembered. Rather than being seen as a victim of circumstances, or his generation as being victimized by their experience in the First World War, rather than being seen a member of a lost generation or a disillusioned writer, or dislocated by the experiences of war, Chapman's words here give pause to easy generalizations by academics about those who fight and write about wars. Chapman writes, "I'm never grateful for comment, however sensible, in that war from men who are not in it. My gain from it is of only importance to myself. For the rest, I am conscious of loss, the lost friends I knew for such a short time, the impoverishment of life." And this is interesting, because he takes aim at Wilfred Owen here. He says, "The poetry is not the pity, to hell with your generalized pity. What the survivor remembers is not the fears he knew, the pains, but the faces and a few words of the men who were with him." Those men that were with him are the men you see behind me. That's Chapman's battalion of the 13th Royal Fusiliers at the Somme. Now, I'd like to show you quickly, because I think it may be close to being at the end of time. I want to show you quickly this digital history project that I've been doing at Gettysburg College, and then I'll conclude, okay? So we are lucky at Gettysburg College because a few years ago, a former student of mine, he was actually a current student of mine, he came to me and said, "I have my great-grandfather's old First World War letters. Would you like to have a look at them?" And I said, "Sure." And so he brings them in, and there were 273 letters, plus assorted ephemera from this man's service in the First World War. The man is H.J.C. Pears, also known as Jack Pears, P-E-I-R-S. He went in as one of those Kitchener volunteers at the beginning of the First World War, was commissioned in the 8th Queen's Royal West Surrey Regiment, and ends up a lieutenant colonel by the end of the war. He wins the DSO with 2 bars as the war is ongoing, and he's given 2 of those DSOs actually by George V. So he's decorated during the war, and then after the war, his papers fell to his family, and then his family has graciously loaned them to Gettysburg College so that I can use them with my students. So over the last few years, we've put together a digital history project on his letters. And I just want to walk you through it, and I encourage all of you to go. We also have a Facebook page. So we have a Facebook page for the project. There's a Twitter account at Jack Pears. And we also have an Instagram page. So we're trying to cover the social media bases here. So what you'll see with the project is that we are digitizing and putting up his letters 100 years to the day in which he wrote them. So we published the letter 100 years to the day in which he wrote it. This last one is from May 11th. It's a letter to his mother. You have the original source over here. You have the transcription here. And for some of the letters, we have commentary that we run. So we've been putting together some commentary under the tag of chatting, in which we write blog posts on some of these to give additional context. And we have students working on this, as well as me, and as well as some administrators. If you're worried, or if you're interested in who he's writing letters to, we have biographies of the family, so you can see exactly who he's writing the letters to in his correspondence. And one of the more interesting pieces that we've put together for this year is a map of 1917, in which you can see how Piers and his battalion are moving in and out of the trenches, where we have connected with this some primary sources or information from the regimental war diary. And it shows you the back and forth that an Army officer would have going in and out of the line as he was actually doing it, with then a map. And here he's given the DSO by George V. This is the telegram that's summoning him to Buckingham Palace. We have that in the collection. And then he goes from there back to France and back in and out of the trenches. So we've been putting a lot of time into this, and again, we have students working on it as well as our staff, in trying to in many ways take a small collection, one person's collection of World War I letters, and make them accessible to a wider audience. So that's some of the work that we're doing at Gettysburg College. So. So Piers was from, his family's from Carlisle, which is in Surrey, but he was a London attorney. So his office was in London, and he lived in London at the start of the war. And he comes from a very kind of privileged background. He went to Charterhouse School, the same school, and then he went to New College, Oxford.
Yeah, I really intrigued by your presentation because of the changes of attitude. Because of the nonfiction realm, a lot of the mythology, some truth to it about essentially that the generals are donkeys and the troops are lions and it's lambs to the slaughter, which is wholly not true. It has some truth, but that I think is the perpetrated myth that you're referring to. I think that's what most people view the Western Front as being. Churchill, oddly enough, was one of the people that perpetrated that, as did Liddell Hart.
Right.
So there's a lot of nonfiction stuff in addition to the literature talk. Well, you alluded to it, but there's a lot of this stuff, and it's very interesting. I'm glad you brought it to how much difference along the spectrum and where it occurred in the sources of those literature, at what time period, because that's fascinating presentation.
Well, thank you. And it is one of those things that for every kind of myth or generalization that you make about the way that soldiers feel during the Great War, you will find sources that say something a little bit different, right? And so with the idea of like lions led by donkeys, that your average soldier was a victim of kind of callous or cruel generals, that's one of the kind of interesting ways to look at that question is to move away from the authors that are writing that, and then to see all of the authors that ask their senior officers or generals to write the prefaces to their war memoirs. And there are a number of them that did. They had great respect for the men in which they were fighting. They wrote prefaces for the war books, and that's an indication that there was a lot of respect there.
Ian, thank you for your excellent and penetrating analysis of the war literature. You prefaced it with some of the Civil War literature. Certainly Ambrose Bierce was a veteran, but he was very much a cynic. Mark Twain had tangential connection with the Missouri State Guard before he deserted. He's a smart aleck. But people who write memoirs seek to give a more or less accurate account of their experiences probably putting a positive light on things, but still there's a great difference between a memoir or a unit history on the one hand versus a short story or a work of fiction on the other. But for World War I, you seem to be describing memoirs rather than just works of fiction that interweave these changing perspectives on the war. And certainly you've given us a valuable corrective that All Quiet on the Western Front is not solely representative of the attitudes of the soldiers who actually fought.
Yeah, that's a fantastic point. And I'm actually glad that point came across too, because it's one of those things as I was talking about, I'm like, I'm not sure if this actually resonated. But there is a huge difference between nonfiction and fiction. Huge difference, okay? And one of the major differences is that when you publish a nonfiction book, there's an understanding of accountability that comes with that, right? So if you're a veteran and writing a nonfiction book, there are people who served with you who can actually criticize the details of your nonfiction book, right? And especially when you consider things like libel laws, this actually becomes a big deal. It becomes a big deal. Now, what's interesting is, and I think you're spot on with Civil War memoirs. You know, with First World War memoirs, though, you do see a number of people that write a disclaimer at the beginning of their World War I memoir that says something like, "Well, I lost my sources, so I'm working just from memory alone. So please forgive me if there's anything imperfect within my narrative." And some publishers actually advise people to publish under pseudonyms. So Charles Carrington was advised by his publisher to publish under a pseudonym just in case he got the details wrong. Robert Graves doesn't care, but Charles Carrington did. So, great point.
Is there anything like this going on for the American perspective?
Like the Peers Project?
Like the Peers Project, yeah.
Well, I haven't surveyed widely the digital history of American kind of projects. There are a lot of them that have crept up in the last year. Some of them are actually affiliated with universities. So, like Bucknell is doing, I think Bucknell in the First World War. Virginia Polytechnic has Virginia Polytechnic in the First World War. So there are specific websites that are tied to either community or institutions. And we were tempted with the idea of a Gettysburg and the Great War project, but this one was right in our hands, and so we just decided to put this one out.
But there's a different perspective, you know,
Yes.
from an American perspective versus British. If you know the cultures.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a huge difference. If anybody knows of a project like that, make sure to let me know or email it to me, because I'm very interested in kind of scanning the landscape.
Now, you mentioned something about you're getting the book out?
The book's out, yeah.
Okay, and that is?
It's called Remembering the Great War, and it's published through IB Taurus. And AHEC is thanked in the acknowledgments. So.
Several years ago, right across the hall here, there was a presentation. I think some of you were there. I can't remember the guy's name. Who talked about World War I and tried to paint a picture. There was a picture painted in much of the literature that Americans who came back from World War I were damaged goods. A lot of PTSD, a lot of people who became criminals and that sort of thing. And he posted a lot of American literature who portrayed people like that. I can't recall the guy's name. He had published a book, did all this research, and the bottom line really was that Americans who went to serve in World War I basically came back into their communities, became respected leaders, educators, business people, professionals, or something like that. And much of the literature that had come, American, this is American, not British, American literature really was inaccurate how they portrayed people. I can't remember the guy's name who did this, but it was really an interesting analogy, an expose of the difference between reality. And he went back into all these different histories of folks throughout the United States and what a lot of the literature published mainly by American authors, and a lot of it being fiction pieces portrayed of American soldiers coming back from World War I.
I mean, that's a very interesting point. And
Doughboys in the Great War.
Doughboys in the Great War, that's it.
it's a very, yeah, and he's published a book too.
Yes.
Because I
Thank
read
you.
So that's a very interesting point, and it's a point that I think is an important one in that when we read war literature, especially when you read war novels, you shouldn't necessarily be looking for any war novel to be the experience of all soldiers in a conflict, right? Because oftentimes novels are written to tell a good story, or to tell a provocative story. And many of them are coming from the avant-garde, which is, most of us don't live our lives within the avant-garde. You know, I live my life mostly in my office grading and reading, okay? And so it's one of these things where, you know, you can understand something about the experience of war from war literature, but you can't stereotype all veterans based on it. Now, what I will say is that there's been some very impressive scholarship by some of my colleagues in the idea of shell shock itself. And shell shock, you know, emerges as a diagnosed mental illness during the First World War. But there's also a cultural angle to shell shock. And this is kind of the more fascinating thing, that shell shock pervades people's sensibility in the 1920s and 30s, and people start talking about the trauma of war, or how difficult the war was, or how dislocating the war was in terms of shell shock. So it goes from being something that's very clinical, has a very narrow sort of diagnosis during the war, to then being something much broader within our culture. And I would say that we can in many ways see a similar parallel with PTSD in our present age, right? In which you see something that is very clinical on one hand, but then it's something that is in many ways seen as something wider, kind of in the ether of veterans' experiences. So people were talking that way in the 1920s too.
Several times you mentioned about a lot of this coming from diaries. I remember reading, I think, the old read of World War II, they ordered not to keep diaries for various reasons. Is that as a result of some of these World War I books coming out and causing impact on the society?
Well, I think it has more to do, if the soldier's captured, they don't want the exact movements of the soldier within their diary. So when you're captured, it's going to be assumed that your papers are going to be taken from you. And if you have a diary that's recounting your war experiences or unit morale or people's names and things like that, it could actually be very, very damaging from an intelligence perspective. So I think it has less to do with people kind of writing diaries in World War I. Diaries were forbidden in a lot of armies, in a lot of units during World War I. It didn't stop people from taking them. They still did it. And, photographs were forbidden too. But there were a lot of officers with little Kodak cameras that took jaunty pictures of each other at the front. But yeah, a lot of authors wrote from diaries. Now, one thing I will say about trench diaries is that if you've looked at them, oftentimes they don't give you that much information. So they're usually just a record of basic things, a few sentences that happened to a person that day. Yeah.
It's like a journal.
So isn't it a little remarkable that these letters were actually able to show where the soldier moved from trench to trench?
Well, this has taken a substantial amount of work by one of my colleagues, Amy Lucadamo, because Pierce doesn't mention where he is within his letters. But we have his unit's war diary is online, and you can look up the movements of the battalion. So we're seeing Pierce's movements through the battalion. Yeah.
That's amazing.
And so most of this movement comes from that. But when Pierce is like, I visited the dentist, we often don't know exactly where the dentist is. We just assume it's within a 3 or 4 mile place. We're still trying to track down a brewery in which his men went to bathe in Belgium. And the problem is there's a lot of breweries in Belgium, so we're trying to find the right one.
Are we out of questions?
All right, well, thank you very much.
We wish we had first-class tickets to Paris, but we don't. We have to give you this certificate of appreciation. Thanks for bringing this today. We're very grateful.
Thank you.